Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy and I am assistant editor of the journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. In 2016, the FHQ will continue publishing a series of 6 special issues in recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513. Next year's special issues are dedicated to Florida history during the 19th century. The first, covering the years 1800 to 1870, will be guest edited by James Cusick, curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History at the University of Florida Library. The second, covering the years 1870 to 1920, will be guest edited by John David Smith, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Please look forward to publication of these issues in 2016. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. John Paul Nuño, assistant professor of history at California State University at Northridge. In today's interview, Dr. Nuño and I discuss his article titled Republica de Bandidos, the Prospect Bluff Fort's Challenge to the Spanish Slave System, that was recently published in the fall 2015 issue of the FHQ.
Professor Nuño, thanks for joining us on the podcast. Can you tell our audience a little bit about your background?
Well, my name is John Paul Nuño, and I was born in the Central Valley of California, a small town called Porterville. My family arrived to the area from Mexico in the 1960s. My father's from Guadalajara, and my mother's from a small town in the state of Durango. And so I went to the local university there, which was California State University, Fresno. And so I was a history major at Fresno. I knew I wanted to go to grad school and get a history PhD, but wasn't quite sure in what area or how I wanted to specialize. And it was one of the advertisements that had this slogan, and I still remember it, and I think they still use it, which was study the border on the border. And they also had a big poster of it in the hallways of the history department. And this was for a new doctoral program at the University of Texas at El Paso. And this just instantly caught my eye. And even though I was looking at other places, but I wanted to look more into this new Borderlands program that they were doing at UT El Paso. And as a Mexican American, it appealed to me to study on the border and to kind of deal with border issues. So consequently, I applied and eventually enrolled in the program. And the program at UTEP in its early years was more focused on the southwestern borderlands. But fairly quickly, there were a number of classes that started to branch out and look at kind of non-Chicano issues, looking into other areas. And it was one of the earliest classes that I took with a professor by the name of Maceo Daly. And unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, Maceo Daly passed away. But he was one of my early mentors, and he taught a class about African Americans on the borders or on the borderlands. And it was in his class that I did a research paper on the Black Seminoles. And I got kind of drawn into Black Seminole history. I looked at the population in Brackettville, Texas, the population in Coahuila, and then eventually, of course, being drawn into Florida. So it was the Black Seminoles as a topic that really got me interested into the Florida borderlands. And I eventually branched out from just looking at the Black Seminoles to looking at kind of race and identity in this area. And I think like a number of other scholars, I was curious to see how the stuff I was reading about in the Southwest from scholars like James Brooks, Susan Deed, Cynthia Radding, how this kind of scholarship and the frameworks that they were using could be applied to the Southeast. So in this way, I would say that I came to Florida history in a roundabout way. I was trained as a Southwestern borderlands historian rather than being rooted in Southern history.
That's a fascinating story. You've given us a fascinating tale about how someone gets to study Florida history. Now, getting to the topic of your article in the Florida Historical Quarterly, I think many of our audience or in our audience know something about Prospect Bluff, But for those of us that don't know much about it, can you tell us or give us a general description of Prospect Bluff and what happened there in the early 19th century?
Sure, I'd be happy to do it. Prospect Bluff and the fort that was built at Prospect Bluff has received a lot of scholarly attention for good reason. I mean, it's a very interesting site. The fort that was built there is imbued with a lot of meaning. The location itself, Prospect Bluff, is located on the Apalachicola River, and the area where the fort itself was constructed is a few miles north of where the river's mouth meets the Gulf of Mexico. The river itself had served as the boundary between East and West Florida. As a Florida historian, I feel like every paper we write, we always have to go in with a little footnote about East and West Florida to let them know about it. But of course, the Floridas had been divided from the British period on. The river, the Apalachicola River, had served as the boundary. In 1814, a fort was built there by the British Army with assistance of the runaway black slaves and the Restic Creeks and the Seminoles during the War of 1812. The reason they built the fort at the spot in the river was because of its very defensive location. It was on top of a steep hill on the eastern bank of the river. It was surrounded by swampland, which made an inland approach to the fort very difficult. So it was a very defensible position. But yet, on the other hand, because it was close to the Gulf, and also because if you went north, you could then link into other river systems and go into the Lower Creek territory. It had access. It had access to the Atlantic world. It had access to what we usually call Indian country, where native peoples had control and where their settlements were located. The British eventually evacuated in 1815, and they left the fort in the hands of the runaway slaves and the indigenous peoples who were in the area. My article talks about how the Spanish sent a number of envoys to the fort, most famously Vicente Sebastián Pintado, to reclaim their slaves. And it's Pintado who goes to Prospect Bluff, and he describes it. And one of the phrases that he uses is that he calls it a republic of bandits. And I kind of use this phrase as a guiding central framework for my article. And I argue that the Spanish used a discourse of black criminality in order to justify their efforts to resubjugate the slaves that were there at the fort. And that the fort itself represented a threat to the Spanish colonial system because it encouraged slaves to seek their freedom outside of the system rather than working within it, which a lot of other scholars on Florida have famously talked about how slaves could use the system in order to get manumitted. So I look at the fort in terms from the Spanish angle because the majority of the slaves, or at least a large number of the slaves at the fort, were from the Spanish. And I feel like that was an angle that hadn't been done before. But back to the fort itself, once the British evacuated, it's destroyed by the Americans in 1816. Many of the occupants had already evacuated and gone into the interior and then spread out throughout the interior of Florida. A year later, you have the U.S. invading Pensacola in East Florida during the First Seminole War. And the U.S. later builds a fort called Fort Gadsden on the spot where Prospect Bluff was once located, which gives you an idea of kind of how strategic the location was and how advantageous it was to have built the fort there in the first place, and how dangerous it was from the perspective of these colonial national powers that you had a number of runaway African slaves occupying this very strategic fort in that area.
That's interesting. You often hear about forts and settlements in places like this in the Americas, and they obviously have local significance, but you have to question if they have broader significance. When you think about Prospect Bluff and what happened there and what you described, Were there any immediate or long-term effects on the general region or emerging United States or even the Atlantic world at this point?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Prospect Bluff and with events in the Florida Borderlands is that you have kind of two different scales. You have what happens locally, and then you have kind of a larger regional implications. Because Florida is so accessible, on the one hand, it's seen as the periphery of the Spanish Empire, periphery of this emerging nation state, the United States. But on the other hand, because of its location on the Gulf and on the Atlantic world, what happens there spreads fairly quickly. And that was one of the reasons why the fort itself was destroyed, because of the fear that Pintado had of what it could do along the Gulf Coast, where the Spanish were dealing with a number of independence movements. And in the U.S., right, they're worried about Southern slaveholders and the implications of having an armed fort nearby. So, yeah, you're right. You have kind of these two kind of different scopes interacting with each other. For the Spanish, reading the primary sources, in terms of a short-term impact, I mean, you really see how their inability to control their slaves and the indigenous peoples served as a justification for U.S. invasion during the First Seminole War, and even before that when they destroy the fort. And you see it in the correspondence where they feel kind of on the defensive because they also want to subjugate the fort and recover their slave property, rather than perhaps coming to some sort of an accommodation with the slaves, perhaps being able to utilize the fort in the defense against American expansionism, which they had already been experiencing at that point. And Spanish Florida, of course, had been famous for the use of black militia and kind of pragmatic policies in order for the Spanish to survive in the area. But you see in the documents that they also kind of feel the sting of these arguments that the Americans make, that they're unable to control their borders, they're unable to control these African and indigenous peoples there. And so in much of the correspondence that you see, they have very similar perspective to the Americans. A lot of the similar language, that this is, these are bandits, these are a lot of unsavory characters are there, and this is undermining the tranquility of Spanish colonial society and racial hierarchies, and so it's just a threat. So Spain actually, of the different American incursions into Florida, this is one that when the Americans go and destroy the fort, they don't actually protest. And I think there's a short-term impact in the sense that their ability to not come to terms with Prospect Bluff, other than kind of hoping for its destruction, really seals their fate in terms of the U.S. expanding and really projecting its power and eventually annexing the area. So, the paper really looks at the fort from the Spanish perspective, and from the Spanish perspective, I think their willingness to kind of buy into this discourse also kind of helps in their inability to control Florida against the U.S. For the runaway slaves, a lot of great scholarship has come out reminding us that the majority of the slaves didn't die in the fort. They had evacuated on the approach of the Americans. And so many of the slaves dispersed into the interior, into the Maroon community at Angola. Some eventually made their way to the Bahamas. And so these slaves would remain, those that remained in Florida would continue to contend with American incursions into the area. Some would join up with the Seminoles. And so for the runaway slaves, the initial impact was that they would have to then go into the interior and continue to find ways to survive. And for the U.S., I think it's well documented by a lot of the scholarship already of the significance that the destruction of the fort had, in the sense that it helped spread what Claudio Sant calls the New Order. increased political centralization, market capitalism, rigid notions of race, and that once the Florida borderlands had been known for racial fluidity, from this point, those spaces start to become minimized. Because it's a borderlands, it doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen with the taking of the fort or with the First Seminole War, but it is an important turning point in which you start to see this transition of kind of these more rigid notions of race starting to take hold with the U.S. coming in. In terms of long-term impact, I would kind of point to the historiography and the literature that comes out of Prospect Bluff. Prospect Bluff occupies a very important place in the imagination of a lot of writers and historians. Early on, it was looked at as a place that was a threat to the South that had to be neutralized. But then on the other hand, you had critics of American support for slavery, abolitionists, the most famous being Joshua Giddings, who wrote The Exiles of Florida in 1858. And they looked at the fort as evidence of how the U.S. government was supporting slavery and how they went in and destroyed the fort. But what a lot of this scholarship did is that it really cemented in the minds of most people this kind of bipolar situation, where with the U.S. representing kind of hardened racial identities, and Spanish Florida represented this kind of slave sanctuary. And I think that's went a long way into cementing this kind of image of Florida as a slave sanctuary, or always a place where race relations were fluid, where I think it's can be a bit more complicated than that. But I think that image really comes out of the literature that talks about Prospect Bluff.
So definitely a set of short-term and long-term impacts, even on the area of your scholarship. You cover the historiography and you mentioned your perspective, but how do your conclusions fit into that historiography? How do your conclusions about Prospect Bluff differ from those of other historians?
Well, I don't think it's so much an issue of conclusions. There's a number of different conclusions, and recently I'm thinking of kind of Claudio Sant's work, Nathaniel Millet's work, and I think my work, in terms of kind of my main arguments, I don't think they really contradict each other. I think what it is really just looking at the fort from a different perspective, and then kind of finding different meaning and significance out of it, which is not necessarily contradictory, but it's just in terms of kind of what perspective that you're looking at it. And I'm a big advocate coming out of as I mentioned before, the Borderlands program at University of Texas, El Paso. I'm a big advocate for Borderlands really being the ideal framework to look at Florida history. And so consequently, I think, you can have events that are multidimensional and that are complex and can have different meanings depending on the kind of perspective that you look at it. When I was looking at Prospect Bluff, what I noticed was that, a large number of the slaves were from Pensacola. A number were from East Florida. The leadership at the fort were also Spanish slaves. And so this didn't really seem to be covered in kind of many of the narratives that dealt with the fort. It seemed to be kind of seen from a U.S. perspective. You had Claudio Sant looking at it from the perspective of the Creek Civil War. You have Nathaniel Millet, who was looking at it from this model that he calls the Atlantic Borderlands, and the impact that the British ideology had, mainly Edward Nichols, and the role of the African slaves at the fort. And so I think their arguments all have merit, and I think that there's a lot of insight that they bring to it. But I felt that you really haven't covered kind of what it meant that there was such a large number of Spanish slaves at the fort, that no one had really addressed that in kind of an article, or people had mentioned it, but no one had really kind of whether there was any significance behind that or not. And so my conclusion is that the fort really complicates kind of our understandings of Spanish slavery, where there tends to be kind of this generalized notion that Spanish slavery is fluid, that slaves have kind of this ability to move throughout the different status that they can get manumission. And I think there's also a lot of merit in that framework as well. But I thought that the incident at the fort really gives us an opportunity to say, or to look at this and say, well, you can't say that it's always this case, especially in the Florida Borderlands where there's so much diversity. It's really hard to say that there's this one discourse on slavery and race that wins out all the time, or that holds steady all the time. One of the things I talk about in the article is the kind of fusion of Euro-American planters into East Florida. But then you just have all these different people who are around and have their own notions of race and identity, and that they influenced each other. And so I use that as a way to say, maybe we could look at Spanish slavery not just as this mirror to the U.S. and always as kind of this foil saying, well, here it was more liberal and it was more fluid, but also kind of look at it as a slave system in which it is based on whiteness, it is based on control, and kind of judge it on that level rather than just always comparing it to the U.S. South. And so one of the things that I argue is that what the fort tells us, or what it shows, is that it was just as much a threat to the Spanish as it was to the U.S., because the Spanish slave system was based on slaves buying into it, was based on them trying to utilize these avenues to manumission, although, not that many of them actually were able to do this, but it was predicated on getting them to buy into this system. And the slaves at Prospect Bluff, and one of the points that I make, were really determined to get out of the system. They no longer wanted to buy into it. And because of that, it represented a major threat to the Spanish. And Jane Landers, whose work is her seminal work in the Florida Borderlands is tremendous, and it's been very helpful for those of us who have written about Florida afterwards because of the quality of the research. But she's got a great line in her work when she talks about slaves voting with their feet when they ran away from, I think she meant the British, but then maybe also the U.S., and they ran away to Spanish Florida. And one of the things that I think about when looking at the Florida Borderlands is that I feel that sometimes these slaves also recast their vote when they ran away from their Spanish masters, which would happen when you had slaves running away to the Seminoles. And in this particular case, slaves taking the British up on this offer that they get to go to Prospect Bluff, and then being really determined and refusing to return when they're given the opportunity.
So your interpretation is fleshing out some of the other interpretations. In my reading of your work, I like how you approach it from the Spanish Florida angle, because I agree that most interpretations have been from a U.S.-centered angle. Based on what you've said and what we've talked about, and of course what you talk about in your article, what do you think your work says about race and slavery in early 19th century Florida? Or how should scholars and the general public reevaluate the region based on what you have found in terms of Prospect Bluff?
Well, I mean, I think my work falls into line with recent scholarship, especially borderland scholarship, in the sense of always trying to complicate pre-existing narratives and always trying to look for nuance and complexity. And that might be hard in terms of trying to kind of get that across to the general public, because it's always easier to teach kind of a overarching narrative. It's always kind of easier to teach narratives that are easy to comprehend. But I think the way that the scholarship is trending it's really towards kind of problematizing and kind of questioning whether these kind of large-scale general ideas really fit on the ground. And that's really what my work is trying to do, is just trying to kind of complicate that idea. Again, because for me, Florida as a region at this time is I would again argue it's a borderlands. As I mentioned in my last answer, you have kind of all these different groups that are there. Even the Spanish settlers, you know, the Pat and Leslie Company. You have Francis Felipe Fatio, who's a Swiss planter. You have a number of planters after the 1790s when they start granting land to settlers who come in from the U.S. South. And then you have even the indigenous peoples. I mean, you have the Seminoles and kind of their ideas of identity and slaveholding, which can range from, you know, adopting someone to using someone in a kind of harsh labor. There's a whole range to it because slaves, of course, are outside the kinship system, and just any kind of, they can be treated almost in any way. And so I feel like there's really no kind of one generalized idea about race and slavery, but rather all these kind of different ideas and dialogue with each other. And it's kind of situational in terms of seeing which of these ideas kind of are dominant at one moment and then which ideas are dominant in another. And so because of that, kind of my main argument is that we really have to kind of look on the ground, kind of look at these events and not try to kind of place these models on them, but trying to look at kind of the complexity that's going on most of the time.
Dr. Nuño, on behalf of the Florida Historical Quarterly and its audience, I really appreciate you talking with us today, and I am sure everyone is looking forward to reading your article.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ is publishing a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future volumes as well. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.